Hello, this is the Chapter 3 Excel lesson. In this short lesson we're going to talk about how to do a couple of types of graphs in Excel. Specifically we're going to do a relative frequency bar chart, and then we're going to do a scatter diagram. And we're going to look at two examples. First one is example 4.2, which starts on page 40 of the textbook. And the second example is example 3.4, which starts on page roughly 46 of the Excel guide. And so in example 4.2, we are given a set of data in table 4.5 on page 41, which is titled Frequency Distribution Table for Blood Pressure Categories. And so I've started entering that table here. So we've got these four different categories of blood pressure, and we've got some frequencies. And so let's just look at how we can calculate the rest of this table. First thing is let's calculate the total, and we can do that with the sum function, which we've used before. And so there we see we've got our total of 3,533 participants. And then over here we're going to calculate the relative frequency, which I'm just going to abbreviate REL frequency. And so to calculate the relative frequency, we're going to take each frequency and divide that by the total. And then we're going to hit the F4 key to fix the reference to that total. And so now we're going to multiply this by 100 to convert it over to a percentage. And then we'll just copy this down. And then we're going to copy this cell over so that we see we've got a total of 100%. There's our relative frequencies. And let's just make this look a little prettier. We're going to make that bold and center it. And then maybe I don't really need all those decimal places, so let's highlight those cells and do a right click, go to Format Cells, and if it works here, Format Cells. Under Number, let's change this maybe to percentage with 2 decimal places. No, let's just change it to a number with 2 decimal places. And there we go. So there's our relative frequencies out to 2 decimal places. And now let's title this table. And so to make things look prettier, I'm going to highlight these 3 cells and then click the Merge and Center button. And what that's going to do is combine those 3 cells into one. And now I'm going to title this Frequency Distribution Table for the blood pressure categories. And there we go. I'll bold that just to make it look a little nicer. And so there we go. I've got my nice table. Everything's labeled nicely, and it looks neat. Okay, so now we want to create a frequency histogram for this data, and what we're going to do here is create figure 4.6 on page 44 of the textbook. And so to create this histogram or bar chart, let's do a frequency histogram. So let's highlight these 2 columns here, which contains the categories and the frequencies, and then we're going to hit Insert, Column, 2D Column, and it looks like this. Now it doesn't look quite as nice as figure 4.6 in the book. We're going to fix that here a little bit. So first of all, under the chart tools, let's clean this up here to make it look a little nicer. First of all, I don't really need this label here, so let's highlight that and delete it, and that makes it look nicer to begin with. And so now let's put a title here on the vertical axis. So under Layout, let's go to Axis Titles, Primary Vertical, Rotated, and then I'm just going to type my title here, which is Frequency, and then hit Enter, and it changes that to Frequency. Okay. Now I don't really like these horizontal lines, so I'm going to left click on those and hit Delete, and so now they're gone. And so now we can change the way these bars look. So let's do a right click, Format Data Series. And one difference between this chart and what's in the book is in the book they don't have any gap between the columns, and so we can change this gap width. We'll just drag this down to 0, So we see now there's no gap width, there's no gap. Under fill, I can change the color. Maybe I want more of a gray color, like what they have in the book. And then border colors, you see it's kind of a light line around these columns. And maybe I want a little bit darker, so let's go solid. And color, I can change that to whatever. Let's do the black. Border styles, we can change how thick we want that. Maybe I want a little thicker like this, 1.5. And when it looks the way you want it, you hit close, and there you go. We're all done. So there's our frequency histogram for those blood pressure categories. In our next example, this is example 3.4 from the Excel guide. We're going to create another type of graph here, one that we call a scatter plot or a scatter diagram, or it goes by other names. And so in this example, we have some data from 12 different participants, which we just call participants 1 through 12 there. And so this data here comes from figure 337 on page 47 of the PC Excel guide. And so for each one of those participants, we recorded their body mass index and then their systolic blood pressure. And what we want to do here is to create a graph that shows the relationship between the BMI and the systolic blood pressure. It's kind of hard to see any sort of relationship just by looking at those numbers, but we're going to create a graph that shows those relationships. So after you've entered the data, highlight those two columns, go Insert, and then Scatter. And there's lots of different options here. We're going to choose this first one here, Scatter with only markers, and it creates a graph that looks like this. Now let's clean this up, make it look a little bit nicer. And so under Design, let's choose this chart layout, which is going to add a chart title and then axis titles. And so what we've done here on the horizontal axis, that's going to plot the data that was in the leftmost column, which was BMI. So let's title this axis BMI. And then the column on the right is going to go on the vertical axis. So let's highlight this, and we're going to title that Systolic Blood Pressure. And then for the chart title, we could title this whatever we want. I'm just going to title it Systolic Blood Pressure versus BMI. And so there's my chart title. Now I really don't need this legend here, so let's get rid of that. Likewise, I don't really need these horizontal lines, so let's get rid of that. And so there's a graph that shows this relationship between the body mass index and systolic blood pressure. Now it's kind of hard maybe to see a relationship at this point because we're kind of zoomed out. And so to zoom in on the data, let's change the scales on our axes here. And so if we do a left click on one of these numbers on the horizontal axis, go to Format Axis, and then we can change the minimum and maximum values here. So like the minimum value, if we look at our data, our body mass index don't ever go below 20. So let's just set the minimum here to 20. And then the maximum, it looks like about the max they go is maybe just a little over 40. So let's set the max to like 45. That was probably bigger than we really needed. But now let's kind of do the same thing for the vertical axis. So do a right click on one of those numbers, go Format Axis, and the systolic blood pressures don't ever go below 100. In fact, they don't even go below 120. So let's set the min to like 110. And then the max, it looks like the maximum systolic blood pressure we've got over here is maybe 165. So let's set the max to maybe 170. And then we'll hit close. And so there we go. We've kind of zoomed in on the data. And what we see is that those dots, so we've got one dot for each data value. So if like we mouse over a dot there, we see that's a dot for the person that has a body mass index of 22.9 and a systolic blood pressure of 115. And so we see that is that person right there. And then each person has their own dot. And so we can kind of start to see a trend here as we move from left to right. The body mass index increases. At the same time, the systolic blood pressure increases. and those dots kind of form a straight line. And so to illustrate that straight line a little bit better, let's do a right click on one of the data points, doesn't matter which one, and let's do add trend line, and we can select different types of lines to add there. Let's choose this linear, and there are other things we can set here, but we won't deal with those right now. And so there we go. You drew a straight line that captures the general trend of the data. Now later on this semester we're going to talk a little bit more about this trend line and how that works, but right now that trend line is just there to show the trend of that data. And so it forms kind of a straight line. As we move from left to right, the body mass index increases, and so does the systolic blood pressure. That helps illustrate that relationship between these two variables.